Hey guys, and welcome back to Rage Gaming and a little Necromancer discussion style video for Season 5. We're in a bit of a weird spot, I'd say. Necromancer's fallen from popularity this season for a few reasons, while Rogues and Sorcerers, they're having the greatest time by comparison. We're not alone though. Barbs are definitely having their first problems ever, and Druid actually has one saving grace build that's incredible, but that overview is just to give context to what I mean when I say I think Necromancer is at the bottom of the ladder for the classes in Season 5, maybe sharing that spot with Barbarians based on what they've been saying. And it is funny because Barbs share a similar problem to us right now in that they have two top builds and the two have major problems with two different sides of the game. So I want to talk about our top builds, show them what's great, but also what's really bad about them, and gauge what I think could be improved for the class in general, but also how this makes sense, and really it was expected after Season 4. So let's get into it, beginning with what I believe are two continual issues for the class. The first and main thing for me every season is how squishy Necromancer is. And that might surprise some people, especially if you're playing right now. You've been playing for a couple weeks at this point and you've got all your gear and you're really actually quite tanky. And here I am saying Necromancer's squishy. Until you get that insane gear to overcome that fact, it's just gonna be paper. That initial week where I'm grinding my gear and we're taking on the tormented bosses, I'm just being one-shot by all these mechanics while my friends that are playing literally Rogue and Sorcerer are just standing and stuff, and it doesn't matter. The Sorcerer has the shield on and it's just mitigated. The Rogue has basic barriers that they're able to get charged up and functional with just a aspect that it's consistent enough, and then even then they have the mobility to evade super easily. That isn't to say that Necromancer can't become quite tanky, as we all know. For all the healing, the fortify, the shielding and general DR that you can get, it can be really tanky. But what is it you need to do to really achieve that tankiness? Well, it's things like the Shaco Mythic Unique. It's things like the Doombringer Mythic Unique. If you're playing an overpower build, which Bone Spirit and also Blood Surge are tied to that, you're having to give up your leg slot for the unique that's going to charge up your overpower damage. So you have just your helmet and your chest piece, and so what are you going to put there? Shielding Storm for the massive shield, that's awesome. Or Hardened Bones with the 25% DR, that's also really nice. But you can't use both of them because ideally you'll be using the 20% DR from a Shaco's on your helm. It almost feels to me, at least in terms of Necromancer and its squishiness, that we need like an extra slot. I look to Barbarians that have 4 weapon slots, and I look to Rogues that have 3. They're able to fit more aspects into their build compared to us, and this is the season where we saw them kind of address that, or at least attempt to, by messing with our scaling with our main stat. But it doesn't change the fact that we have less aspect slots and we don't have like a reliable DR option. Bone Storm, sure, 15% DR and the potential shield if you run Shielding Storm, and then Blood Mist, sure. But can you fit Blood Mist into a Bone Spirit build? Yeah, but you're going to be sacrificing something pretty important. So their base survivability, I feel, is just still an issue alongside their mobility, because oh my god, we're still the slowest class in the game, despite the fact that they added multiple new aspects this season that help mobility. But let's say you're playing the quote-unquote best build for the season for us, which is Bone Spirit. We are using the new unique boots, which are required because it causes maximum resource increases. So you simply do not have a mobility slot to give up for the new mobility aspects. It's so funny. And even if you could, again, can you really run Blood Mist in this build? It's hard to justify. And that's where we're getting a bit of mobility from. Blood Mist in that new aspect. It's not like we're using the Golem mobility aspect because we're not running Golem. So yeah, I guess that's the main aspect that I feel is annoying about Necromancer. It feels like we don't have enough skill slots. It feels like we don't have enough aspect slots to run what makes this thing kind of feel good to function. And we're going to get into that as we talk about Bone Spirit. So those key issues haven't massively changed. You still need hyper gear to overcome being a pushover. Compared to the other classes, achieving it much sooner, much easier. The mobility problems remain, even though we technically have more options. And you know, when the weak builds that are currently not really being used come into play, we might actually be able to use those mobility aspects. It's not all doom and gloom. There is another core component of this class that's arguably the best out of all of them, and that's the leveling speed. You know, Blood Surge is only better, and Blood Surge is like the ultimate way to level because to get it going at low levels, you don't need anything. You just need Blood Surge and your skill tree, which is amazing. It's my opinion at this point, as Necromancers in Season 5, we never should have touched Bone Spirit, even though we knew it would be the best performing build based on the end of Season 4, and that being the case when people are hyper geared based on its performance in PTR, where they give us everything to, test stuff. Even then, going into Season 5 knowing the main content, which is tier 8 Infernal Hordes at the maximum. For most of us, it might even be tier 7. You don't need to be absolutely devastating with DPS. What you need is survivability and consistent output in AoE. Bone Spirit cannot do that. So we could have been maining Blood Surge the whole way, and it would have been better for everyone if that's how we viewed it. Blood Surge to level, Blood Surge to gear up and generally play the season, and then swap to Bone Spirit if you're ready to sweat, which essentially means pushing Pits really high tiers, of which there is no reason to do that. So no one's really doing that nearly as much this season. I figured we'd have a much worse season following where we had Season 4 when we had the most attention. How they reworked stuff for, say, the Book of the Dead. How they really tried to make minions better, changing their scaling completely to be 100% from our stats. Seeing how almost all the builds in Season 4 were tied to the Blighted aspect and the Shadow Key passive, they kind of over-nerfed it to address that. And that's fair because Shadow builds should be using Shadow. Not every build needs to be using Blighted and involving Shadow because it's just the best way to get maximum damage. They reworked Shadow damage to be better at a baseline, but things like the Blighted aspect, they cut beyond half. So you're not able to work that into a build to get the benefits from it unless you're really committing to Shadow, and then your Shadow builds aren't worth committing to right now because their state just is kind of over-nerfed. And you could say similar about Bone Spear, which has been intentionally cut and crushed over the last seasons until they finally succeeded in making it no longer that worth playing. The current state of minions is better. You have actually some control over the golem where it'll dash to where you try to slam. That was great at the start of the season. I was advocating for leveling in your early late game and gearing up in early late game using golem minion necromancer with burst rather than shadow because I felt that would be more consistent, easier, a better way to gear up for the process of getting to Bone Spirit. It was such a funny experience for me when I was making builds and stuff and talking about that, where I had so many comments saying, we don't care about this, show us Bone Spirit now. And now we have it. People don't want it. Minions is not great right now though anyway. You still have no direct control over the skeletons. It doesn't really have the kind of output of the other builds because again it was relying heavily on Shadow, Shadow Blight, the Blighted aspect that's been cut in half to increase its raw damage. So it also just finds itself in a weird spot. All of that has led us to basically two choices: Bone Spirit or Blood Surge. So the quick overview of Bone Spirit is that it's an awkward build to play for general gameplay. It's designed for pack clearing with gaps between and then also boss killing. Where it shines the most then is hard content like Abattoir of Zir and the Pits. And with the Pits not being that valuable or worth doing, you know, everyone's doing the new game mode, Infernal Hordes, where Bone Spirit conceptually is just a nightmare. It's proven to be the most valuable content by far in Season 5, and even if the Bone Spirit build is strong, which even though its output is one of the best for Necromancer, relative to the other classes, it's certainly not competing. It also performs terribly in Infernal Hordes, where, you know, there's constant packs of weak enemies you can't kill due to the small AoE and the setup and cooldown time between each proper Bone Spirit. So that's where we are now. We've got great output, we've managed to get survivability through extreme gearing, but we still suck at actually effectively farming Aether, and it's just no fun. Even outside of that concept, it's a fact that Bone Spirit requires a lot of setup and effort to play. To get the build functional with all the stuff, 100% crit chance, 275 resources minimum, specific uniques to generate overpower, and then obviously mythic uniques that really get the survivability to work, and then your reward is just like inefficient Aether farming. Plus managing the build is a continuous process. Say when you reach 100% crit chance, now it's time to peel off crit chance off certain things like your offhand. When you're already at reaching 100%, you don't need more, so it becomes a dead stat. And that's kind of the continuous process where you're managing things like that as you get better gear. It takes a lot of effort to get the build working. It takes a lot of effort to play the build. You have to have a genuine understanding of the game. And then you have to manage the build over time, which is just not what, you know, casual people want, clearly. The fall off of interest for a Necromancer in Season 5 because of that is pretty interesting to see. On the other hand, the saving grace for the class is obviously Blood Surge. It takes, by comparison to Bone Spirit, no skill to play. You're simply spamming Blood Surge while maintaining Decrepify and everything, and then maybe you'll press Bone Storm or pull enemies in when you need to. Blood builds in general, because you're building so much max life and everything, become hyper tanky for all the healing and fortify behind the concept. They are easy to push towards Immortal, probably the best out of every build concept we have. Generally, for the Season 5 version of the build, you'll max out on crit damage if you're using the Grandfather mythic, or you could consider going tankier with the Doombringer version, netting you an offensive aspect back. The result is a lot of consistent AoE damage, perfect for Infernal Hordes, which is clearly what they want us to play. And while its single target DPS doesn't even remotely compare to Bone Spirit's insane burst, the simple ease of play, the survivability, the complete lack of skill to make it work, it's just a breath of fresh air after playing Bone Spirit. So everyone's kind of drawn to that right now, understandably. Top necromancers like Vega and Skulm here have been showing how effective Blood Surge is for the main content and how it's not really worth it to play Bone Spirit. And these are people who have proven they know what they're doing at the top of the gauntlet, top of pit pushing, an OG tier 100 in Nightmare Dungeons when that was an actually hard thing in like season 1. Besides Bone Spear and the minion stuff, there are other builds you can consider, like Bone Splinters, and how that has that concept of spreading the splinters out in AoE, a lot more reliable for that mob clear in Infernal Hordes, which is exactly what we're needing. But obviously its single target DPS and that reliable nature of Bone Spirit is now weakened, so you have to ask yourself, why am I playing this weaker Bone Spirit build so that I can AoE clear in Infernal Hordes, when I could just be playing Blood Surge, which simply does it better? There is something that I took a look at just for fun, the whole Shadow Slide build concept. They added a new aspect for Sever and sliding around, spreading shadow that way. It's with the new unique boots, the Reaves of the Empty Tomb, giving you all these extra perks to Sever, and very importantly, causing Sever to leave this desecrated ground on the ground. And when you evade, you leave that desecrated ground on the ground. Compare this to any other build and you're basically stacking up loads of effects, and with damage over time you're stacking loads of damage over time effects. Yet with desecrated ground, it's one desecrated ground, so it doesn't matter how many you spread on the floor, on a line, under a target, one instance of desecrated ground is hitting the target. Even though, let's say you did something crazy like put 100 layers of desecrated ground under a target, it still thinks there's only one. So the idea of the absolutely spamming desecrated ground under a target is completely useless. You can spread it around to hit like a bigger pack of them, I guess, to make sure that they do get hit. But as you can see in single target, where you're getting one desecrated ground effect, no matter how many you're hitting them with, no matter how much you apply it, it completely hardcaps what the potential for this build is. I'm sure it's unintended, but it's funny to look at this, because if you remember the big stream before the season, one of the things they were excited to show us was exactly this.
So what this means is, and we have a video, is that you can evade 5 times, then evade in Blood Mist, and then evade 5 more times. It's silly and hilarious, but we're putting it in the game, and I hope we don't regret it.
Necros are going to be zooming.
Yeah, they're going to be zooming with this. So.
Wow.
Yep, Necros are going to be zooming. We're the slowest class in the game. And Desecrated Ground doesn't stack. Anyway, you can see how they're making use of that new aspect of Creeping Mist, which allows you to evade while you're in Blood Mist. So obviously I wanted to test that, since they showed this. And to run a mobility aspect when you already have a pair of unique boots on means you're giving up a resource slot or an offensive slot, something you really can't afford to do in a build as weak as this. And this is something that they took the time to show us, like they were excited for it, that maybe they expected us to play it this season, you would assume. So I'm so confused by it. And this says nothing of the previous relatively meta build for shadow damage and shadow damage over time, which was Blight. Last season, that was just below your top builds, like Bone Spirit, and of course Golem Minion Necromancer. That, by comparison, does stack its damage because it should. So Desiccated Ground and the effects that spread it desperately need an overhaul or an update or a fix or something. But you could say the same for shadow-based stuff right now in general. But yeah, that brings us to the end of this overview discussion thing. It was expected we'd have a rough season after season 4, where they gave minions so much attention and the class as a whole they felt they'd really put dev time into. Unfortunately, with their hyper focus on minions and then ultra nerfing the shadow scaling damage, they left us without a way to play minions at a good level. All that effort just to cut the damage in half. They've killed Bone Spear as much as they could over the last few seasons, and while it's definitely recovering this season, it's not what it once was, so it's still not great right now. Shadow builds in general are cut too much with the new way they've got the damage scaling and have killed the blighted aspect, and in turn killing fun builds like Infinite Mist. Essentially, you have a choice between Bone Spirit, which requires too much for your average player to get going and to actually play and maintain that build. And then you got Blood Surge, which in my opinion is too boring and too straightforward long term. Literally just pressing one button around a couple of buffs you manage. But it is our best answer right now for the current meta of the game, which is Infernal Hordes. I think it's only going to get harder in the mid-season when they release tier 9 and 10, where maybe we actually need a lot more single target DPS to finish the Fell Council. That'll be interesting. But obviously Necromancer can function in season 5. Between Bone Spirit and Blood Surge, they are functional builds. I would obviously now say that you should play Blood Surge, as it's much easier to get functional and gear up with. Even if you're a sweaty player and really want to play Bone Spirit, I'd still recommend Blood Surge until you've got all the gear you need to do that. No matter what way you look at it, Bone Spirit has consistent clear issues in AoE, and Blood Surge is going to fall off in single target the higher you scale things, like Infernal Hordes tier 9 and 10 when they come. There's no middle ground between the two, like a build that isn't nearly as sweaty and difficult to run and play as Bone Spirit, but also, you know, has a bit more single target and a bit more depth to it than Surge, you know, something in the middle of those two. In terms of changes that I would hope or suggest for, I'm not going to pretend I have the answers that will instantly fix the class. So I'm asking you guys, what do you think we need as a class right now? What would you hope to see in the mid-season patch? For me, I want to see the shadow builds get a massive amount of love. No matter what way you swing it, damage over time isn't a great concept right now. Infernal Hordes is all about bursting enemies down the moment that they're near you. Damage over time just is counterintuitive to that. But all the same, take the base of the shadow damage that we've got and raise it. If they want to nerf things like the blighted aspect and then bring up the bottom of the shadow damage in general to accommodate for that, actually do that. They did not go far enough. With that, we also might see a resurgence of minion builds tying into shadow damage again. Maybe that could be the middle build that we're missing right now. Personally, I want the class to have more base mobility and base survivability. It still feels like we just don't get going soon enough in terms of that mobility, in terms of that survivability. But yeah, let me know what you guys are thinking. Obviously, I want this to be a discussion. I just think it's clear right now that Necromancer is in a weird state in Season 5. For now then, I've been Hollow, you've been you. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.
Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. Goodbye.